Hi, this is Richard and Craig here, coming to you from Monash University, outside on a fairly brisk spring morning.
Yeah, speaking to you through clenched cheeks.
And the sound of birds.
Yeah.
So look, we're more than halfway through the course now, and it's been really great once again seeing so much sharing and support on the forum and reading a lot of the comments. And one of the things that's really struck me this week, Craig, is this sense of community that forms. And I guess I see this a lot when I'm teaching mindfulness face to face, and I'm sure you would as well, but also in this course.
Yeah. And we start off engaging in mindfulness sort of in an individual level. We distract over individual things, we stress over our own individual things, but as you actually look into it, the processes that mindfulness teaches us about are really much more common. So we realise we've got much more in common than in difference, and mindfulness can really bring that to the fore.
Absolutely. Yeah, it starts off being about us in some ways, but then becomes about other people in the end.
Yeah. So if we understand ourselves better, it helps us to understand others better too.
Absolutely. Craig, some learners mention it seems to take a lot of effort to practice mindfulness.
It takes a lot of effort to make it effortless, yes. Yeah. Mindfulness is a non-habitual thing. It, in a way, goes in a different direction to the way the mind's used to going. And when we do something non-habitual, it does require effort. Like there's an old exercise, you cross your arms the usual way, and then when you cross your arms the non-habitual way, it requires a lot more effort and attention.
And feels a bit awkward in the beginning
It
too,
does.
doesn't it?
It feels uncomfortable, to have your arms crossed in the opposite way. And so it's a little bit like that you practice mindfulness and you've got to pay attention. It takes more effort and it doesn't feel so comfortable initially until we rewire the brain, and the brain, new pathways for attention start to get reinforced, and then it gets easier and easier.
Yeah. It is also possible to put too much effort in sometimes, particularly with meditation, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's almost like tuning the instrument, the string of a guitar or something. You don't want it too tight, too loose. Just finding the right amount of concentration and effort can be pretty helpful.
That's right. And one of the things that can sometimes make mindfulness difficult is we're trying to concentrate and be present by wrestling with thoughts and distractions, rather than just a very gentle way of noticing them and just letting them go. So if we're letting go of all the things that we don't need to be churning our mind about and so on, then, or don't need to be paying attention to now, then there's a kind of relaxation that happens with being more mindful.
Yeah.
So it's about letting go, not wrestling with the distractions.
That's right, yeah. And related to that, some learners noted this week that, of course, it's relatively easy to practice mindfulness when things are pleasant and easy, and much harder to do it when things are difficult, when faced with stress. And you've got a really good metaphor I heard you use the other day about sailing.
Yeah. Well, if we go out on the bay and it's a gentle breeze and the waves are just lapping up against the boat, and it's pleasant and easy, and sailing on those days is pleasant and easy. And then you go out another day and the wind is howling and the waves are all over the place, and it's really hard to keep the boat on an even keel. And we think, oh, gee, I'm not going very well. It's not so pleasant, not so easy. And if our reference point is pleasant and easy, then we like the easy days. But if our reference point is really learning to sail, then we learn much more on the difficult days than we do on the easy days.
Yeah.
And so we can actually welcome those tough days, although we might be critical of ourselves, but just the fact that we even remember to be mindful, let alone practice anything, is really quite a sign of success in itself.
Yeah, and perhaps we enjoy it more on those easy days, and that gives us a sense of enjoyment and maybe a motivation to practice, and then we can remember to do it when things are hard.
Yeah. That's right. But as we sort of hone our skills over days and weeks and months and indeed years, then
decades in some cases.
That's right. Yeah, so it's a lifetime work, but we do learn to master more situations over time.
Yes. We do see that brain change taking place, though, and a few learners asked about that. And certainly my experience practicing and teaching mindfulness is that immediately we start to rewire the brain and train a new habit, and we can start to notice objectively the changes. But to see that neuroplastic brain change takes 8 weeks. It actually takes 8 weeks to see the neurogenesis take place. So certainly, if learners continue meditating for 2 more weeks after this course and then somehow get themselves into a brain scanner somewhere, they might see some change taking place.
And that change happens more quickly, of course, the number of times we remember and apply it, and the consistency with which we do it. If we're sort of 51, 49, sort of the progress is slower. If we're 99 times remembering, and the one, so it really depends a lot on the consistency that we practice, how fast that progress takes place.
And it's a mental fitness too,
Yeah.
building a mindful muscle. I mean, that's literally what we're doing here, rewiring the brain, building a mindful muscle.
Yes, that's right. Now, self-compassion's been a big theme for this week as well.
Yes.
And self-pity and self-compassion are two quite different things. In self-compassion, it's really about an attitude, a sort of a kindly attitude, an attitude of goodwill to others and to ourselves. Compassion, passion as an emotion, and to connect with the emotion, to be aware of the emotional state, but this sort of attitude of goodwill. And now, self-pity is a little bit different. In self-pity, we tend to dive into a story, into a rumination, into a sort of a negativity about ourselves, very self-referential, a lot of default stuff happening there, so very self-referential when it's about self-pity. And that doesn't necessarily help us, but self-compassion is different. And very often, if we're caught in self-pity and negativity and so on, then we can sometimes distort the way that we're looking at things. It doesn't necessarily help us to see and to understand. So self-compassion is quite a different thing, and it doesn't necessarily need a whole lot of activity in mind, a whole lot of rationalizations. It just sort of like is a sense of goodwill within which we are aware of rumination or fear or anxiety or any of the other uncomfortable states that arise.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And some learners mentioned that it's very useful to use with kids, and I certainly, I think of my sister with her 2 young kids, and some of my friends with infants at home, and it's a time to really practice a lot of mindfulness and self-compassion, because it can be quite a difficult period in people's lives, actually.
Yeah.
And the beautiful thing is, of course, if we start to if we show up in a mindful way with kids, if we're self-compassionate, they just start to pick up on that as an attitude.
Yes,
and they soak it up like a sponge. I mean, that's how kids learn, really modelling and soaking things up. So very powerful thing to teach, if you've got kids at home, being mindful, being being compassionate with them.
One of my favourite studies from an educational setting was looking at the maths anxiety that parents had, their anxiety about maths and their performance, and how that correlated with their children in early primary school and their maths anxiety and performance. And surprise, surprise, there was a high correlation. Maths anxious parents tended to have maths anxious kids, but only if the parents regularly helped the child with their maths homework.
So they're like transmitting that anxiety somehow.
That's right.
Yeah.
They thought they were trying to teach the kids about maths, but when they were actually just teaching the children how to be anxious about maths. And those patterns of thinking and behaviour that we model really go in very deep, because children are like sponges and they just take it on board.
Yes.
So if we model self-compassion, objectivity and so on, and all of these things, non-attachment, non-reactivity to things we don't need to overreact to, it really.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Pick it up.
Yeah. And of course, the experiments during this week, and some learners have noticed through doing them that it's much easier often to be compassionate to other people than to ourselves.
Yeah.
Often much tougher on ourselves than we are with others.
I guess we're a little bit closer to home, and we find it hard to sort of stand back and get that objectivity about ourselves. And things seem, closer to home, we identify with them so much more. So when we don't like something, we tend to be much more vociferous in our sort of internal criticism. And all that really does is it just buries us deeper in it.
That's right, exactly.
Paradoxically, a little bit of self-compassion helps us to move on.
Yeah, well, as we said in the step, in the week's exercises, self-criticism has a purpose. We're often trying to motivate ourselves, or we're trying to stop making mistakes, or at least avoid repeating them, even protect relationships. You hurt someone's feelings, oh, you idiot, I can't believe you did that. But it has a real sort of negative effect on us. Activates the fight and flight circuits, makes us feel bad, makes us avoid things. So lots of benefits of self-compassion.
Yeah, in as much as we're able, if we can just be objective, it helps us to see. And very often we see the motivation or the causes behind things that maybe didn't go well, and that helps us to understand. But the criticism often distorts, exaggerates some things, and we don't see other things, and it makes it very hard to actually have insight into our behaviour. Yeah.
And a few learners even said that they can't remember themselves ever being kind to themselves in a difficult situation, which is not unusual, really. I mean, sometimes we're just not taught to relate to ourselves that way. If our parents were critical, or if we never learned to be self-compassionate and patient, We just don't really learn to do that. But of course, anything we practice gets hardwired into the brain.
Yes.
Anything we practice, Aristotle, what did he say? We are what we repeatedly do. So, even just some of the exercises that we introduced this week, if we start to practice them, we can start to sort of, really change our relationship with ourselves in very powerful ways.
Yes. A number of people also commenting on the need for carers to care for oneself. And I think that there's often a bit of a conflict in our mind, care for others or care for ourselves, as if they're two signposts going in the opposite direction. And I think we need to line those signposts up so they go in the same direction, because if we're not looking after ourselves, we can't care for others. And this sort of confusion between self-care and self-indulgence.
Yes.
And if we think self-care is self-indulgence, then we won't do it. And pretty soon we find that we're not really able to care or not care well for those we need to. So self-care is a really important thing to foster for parents, looking after sick relatives or friends or health practitioners and the like.
Yeah. And particularly perhaps for men, Craig, it's Mental Health Week this week. And there's been a really great show on ABC TV, which, so apologies for our international learners, because it's probably only available on Australian sort of online TV, but there's been this great show called Man Up, which is all about the Australian male and how hard it is to talk about emotion and certainly to practice things like self-compassion, and how that can lead to a suppression of emotion and in fact increased rates of suicide. There are 2,000 men who kill themselves in Australia every year, and it's actually the highest cause of death for males between 15 and 44 years old. And so the show really makes the point that, if men can relate to themselves in this more self-compassionate way, if they can express their emotions more clearly, perhaps practice mindfulness, it can be very protective, very good for their mental health.
Yeah, I think there's a confusion sometimes between being able to relate to emotions and weakness.
That's
which
right.
is a very unmale kind of way of thinking, but there can be great strength found in being able to acknowledge our emotions and to learn to relate to them in a more caring way.
Yes. Distinguishing between self-compassion and self-esteem?
Yeah, well, again, the kind of self-esteem, am I good enough, not good enough, trying to think well about myself or thinking negatively about myself, in this sort of internal battle. And it's often one of the main sort of default conversations we have with ourselves. And it can be a very tenuous kind of thing. And so self-compassion is a bit different to that, because in self-compassion we can acknowledge maybe the mistakes and learn from them and move on. But this sort of self-esteem, trying to puff it up all the time or it getting deflated all the time, it can be really not always a great internal sort of dialogue to get caught in. But those who've got sort of a kind of a resilience within themselves are actually able to be more self-honest very often, which is seems to be a bit of a paradox.
Yeah. So Kristin Neff is a big figure in this field. In fact, she sort of more or less started the field of research in self-compassion. So some of our learners have headed across to her website, and there's a link, and found that really useful. So we'd encourage learners who are interested in knowing more about this to head across there and have a bit of a look.
Yes.
Maybe even do some of her meditations.
Yeah, and practicing self-compassion when facing difficulties and so on, and touch and
that's right.
So perhaps to say a bit about that, because a lot of learners were relating very much to that.
Yeah, that's right. So we made it very clear that learners should take it easy with these practices, because it can bring up quite a lot, particularly if you're not used to relating to yourself in a self-compassionate way. Just to start exploring that can bring up a sense of how you don't normally do that, or it can really take you deeply into some stuff that maybe you weren't aware of before. But it seems like a lot of the learners really took it very gently and in a respectful way, explored some of the practices and found it really useful. Some of them chose to postpone it, just to put it off, and of course that's great. Anything in the course that doesn't seem useful or like you're ready for it, very much encourage you just to sort of put it off, maybe come back to it later when you feel ready.
Yes.
But those who did the exercise found it actually really helped to connect with a sense of self-kindness, self-compassion while thinking about or facing a difficulty. And really simple things, soothing touch, very powerful thing, just placing a hand on the heart or somewhere else that feels soothing when we're feeling a bit overwhelmed, actually can be very reassuring, almost like giving ourselves a hug. And there's some research that shows that this can release oxytocin in the body.
It just helps to connect us with ourselves.
That's right, connecting with ourselves, really, really important.
Yes.
The analogy of ink as well, you know, if the emotion or the difficulty is a drop of ink, if we put in a small container like a shot glass, you know, it really changes the tone of the water, or the colour of the water. But if we put it into a lake or an ocean, of course, has a very different effect. And that's the benefit of mindfulness. We create that much bigger space so that we're not so affected by what's happening. And of course, then we might become interested in the temperature and the texture of the water as well. That's where the self-compassion comes in.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
The loving kindness has really resonated with a lot of people this week. And, the issue about loving kindness towards others that we have issues with can be quite a challenge.
Of course it can.
Yeah.
We're not used to wishing people well when they've upset us or hurt us or we have conflict with them. Although if you think about it in a logical way, Craig, you know, people who are happy tend to be really easy to be around. And so the people in our lives who are difficult tend to be quite unhappy. And so in a logical way, it actually makes sense to wish happiness to them, just maybe so that they can be a little bit nicer to themselves and therefore easier for others.
And there's another sort of slight sting in the tail as well, is that very often those people that we don't like and so on, they actually occupy a lot of our mental space.
That's true.
A lot of preoccupation, a lot of rumination about them. And we actually get caught in that story ourselves. And so as much as anything else, wishing them well helps us to release ourselves from our preoccupation about them over the negativity, because that's often the sort of within ourselves, a kind of a prison we create for our own mind. So as much as anything else, it's about releasing ourselves as well as wishing the other person good themselves.
That's right. So the quiz question confused a few people this week because we sort of worded in the negative and asked people to talk about which to select which answer was false. So that's
ultimate test of attention.
Ultimate test of attention. So paying attention during the quiz. And gratitude.
Yeah, well, we're just very grateful for all the gratitude, so I think that's tremendous.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it is good to express that, because I think it really paying attention to the things and acknowledging the things in life that are so easy to miss when we're not paying attention. So it's tremendous.
Yeah. Yeah, so please keep the discussion, the conversation happening. Please keep supporting one another. Keep doing the exercises and the experiments, and we'll see you next week.